With the coronavirus outbreak, not all of us can surf right now, but some of us can. Should we all stay home, or do some of us get to paddle out, and if so, who? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. I originally started writing this episode because I wanted to ask the question of what we should do, how we should treat the beach during the coronavirus pandemic, and then San Clemente answered the question for me. All beaches closed. However, I still think it's an interesting question. I think it forces us to think about this question: who gets to use the beach, in a way that we don't typically think about it. Here's what I mean. There's an interesting tension in surfing. There's an egalitarianism in the surfing community that believes that the beach is for everybody and should be free to everybody. So, for example, if a company came in and bought beachfront property and fenced it off, and so that only people that stayed at, let's say, some resort could surf at that peak, people would be very upset. They would say that's not fair. But there's also a very heavy strain of localism in surfing. The belief here being that the beach is at least primarily for locals. So, for example, it shouldn't be the case that mobs of tourists should be able to clog up the beach and make it so that locals just can't use their local break. How do we resolve these two ideas, that the beach is for everybody and that the beach is primarily for a group of people? It's a question I think about when I go out to my local break and I see a bunch of people clogging it up. And it's also a question I think about when I go to somebody else's local break and now I'm the guest. So how do we resolve those two ideas? Well, it's an interesting dilemma and I want to explore it further in future videos. However, the COVID-19 pandemic has thrown in a few interesting wrinkles. It's forced us to think about these questions a little bit more immediately. And it's given us some possible different reasons for answering these questions and the way we're going to answer them. So today I want to ask the question: who gets to surf during the pandemic? And before I even start to look at that question, I want to make sure that you know that I'm not going to take a stand in this video one way or another. This is a question that people take very seriously and are very passionate about, and for good reasons I totally understand. All I want to do in this video is to explore the way the different philosophies might answer this question. I would like to evaluate them a little bit, but I'm not going to tell you which one I think is right. So first, let's ask the question: how has COVID-19 affected surfing? First, for non-surfers, here's the basic problem. Not every beach is surfable. And even the beaches that are have only a few takeoff points that everybody has to go from. Now, typically, you're not within that 6-foot safety radius that health professionals have suggested that we maintain. However, on crowded days, typically you will paddle within that 6-foot safety radius. And some spots are crowded every day. In fact, here in California, after that stay-at-home order, the beach was more crowded than I've ever seen it before. Guys that typically would be working were out surfing because they had nothing better to do. So on a typical day, you're probably not going to be within that safety range, but on a crowded day, you definitely will. Is there more risk to surfers than to everybody else? Not so far as we know. There was a bit of a scare recently. There was a scientist in UC San Diego who was interviewed by the LA Times, and the article was parroted in Surfer magazine, saying that the ocean's a very dangerous place right now, and that the sea air is going to spread that virus all around. However, she recently clarified that she was quoted way out of context, and that none of those things were actually true. She did say that on breezy days that the virus can carry possibly further than the 6-foot radius, but that wasn't just for surfers, that was for anybody. She also noted that even though it can be taken past that 6-foot radius, since you're outdoors, the air gets dissipated a lot quicker, so that's a good thing. She also said that the virus has a very fragile survival envelope, and it might be the case that the salt and the water and the heat all kill it, although she definitely did not say that it would. She also clarified that it's never actually been found in the ocean. However, no tests have been done to see how long it would survive in the ocean, if it would survive at all. In general, the only difference between her recommendations and everybody else's is that you make sure that you stay clear of the downwind of other people, in the same way that you would steer clear of the downwind of a smoker. That's definitely something you could do as a surfer. The only thing that I think that is different is that we don't really have the face mask ability. So what does all this have to do with who gets to surf? First, let's lay out the following assumptions. Number one, that we should be taking safety precautions to prevent the transmission of this disease. Now, I realize some argue that it's not a bad thing to get this disease. I have friends that text me regularly that say that this is no worse than the flu and that we should go hang out. That's not really the kind of discussion that I'm interested in right here, but if that's how you feel, I still think this video can be fruitful for you. Just imagine we're talking about a disease that really is that bad, something that's really killing off people, it's a totally bad thing, and that we should keep some kind of safety precautions. Also assume that one of the safety precautions we should keep is that 6-foot safety radius, possibly a little bit more based on the breeziness, but just for this video, we'll consider the 6-foot radius and we'll just assume that that's going to keep us safe from getting this disease. Also assume that during this time, most people are going to go outside to exercise. Outdoor exercise is good for both mental and physical health. It's tough to get legitimate aerobic exercise indoors. I realize that some of us have those fancy new Pelotons and everything like that, but not all of us can afford that. I'm not sure if this is true, but I heard that France shut down even for exercise outside. So that's a possibility, but for the sake of this video, let's assume that that's not going to happen. So here's the scenario. Consider one person surfing on the beach. Now, there is zero chance that that person is going to get or transmit that disease to anybody out there because there's nobody else. But also there's a decrease in the possibility of that person transmitting that disease on land. I mean, admittedly insignificant, but still there is a decrease. Now consider two people surfing at opposite ends of the beach. There may be an insignificant increase in the chance that they give it to each other, but there's probably still zero chance. And the chance that they give it to somebody on land or that they get it from somebody on land has decreased a little bit as well. So up to that point, the more people surfing, the better. Now, go just a little bit beyond that point to where the likelihood that somebody's going to breach that 6-foot radius is significant. Now it's the case that although the likelihood that they would pass it around to somebody on land during that time has decreased, still the possibility that they would contract it there and then come back to land and give it to somebody, well, that's increased. So now we're going in the wrong direction. And in fact, we could keep going and imagine a scenario where everybody that could surf is surfing. Now all of a sudden they for sure are breaching that 6-foot radius, they for sure are passing it around, and when they come back on land, they are probably going to give it to other people. So given this scenario, how should we answer this question of who should surf during this time? Well, one philosophy that we could call simplistic egalitarianism would say that everything should be equal no matter what because equality is good in and of itself. So access to the beach should always be equal. That would mean that no matter what, restrictions on who can use the beach, even during the pandemic, would be a bad thing. Now, as I said before, we're assuming that this disease is actually bad, and we're assuming that we should keep that 6-foot radius. But again, consider our scenario. If we have no restrictions whatsoever, and we have that scenario where everybody that can surf is surfing, we for sure are going to breach that 6-foot radius. So, on this view, the only possible solution is for us to totally shut down the beach. Now again, I'm not advocating for this, okay? All I'm doing is exploring what each philosophy might say. And this philosophy would say that if it's not the case that everybody can surf, then no one can surf. Now there's the further question that I'm not really going to explore much in this video of who should enforce this. If you think it's the government's job to make sure that we're all perfectly equal, then the government at some level, whether national, state, or city, should shut down the beach and enforce it. But if not, you think that people should just stay home. Now, one objection to this view in general is that there are many ways that we can be equal, some of which contradict others, so they can't all be right. For example, let's say I want to treat my children equally and it's time to give out allowance. I have a 3-year-old, I have a 7-year-old, and I have a nearly 13-year-old. So let's say I decide to give them all an equal amount of money. Well, either the older one is not going to be able to do anything with the little amount of money that he just got, or the younger one is going to get way more money than she's able to handle. So let's say instead I say, well, okay, I'll make it equal insofar as everybody gets exactly what they need. But then the younger one might actually work harder than the older one does for his money, and now it's like I'm rewarding that older one way more, and he hasn't really done anything. So instead I might say, well, I'll make it equal according to output. Whoever does the most gets the most money, but then again, the little one can't do as much as the big one. So as you can see, there are different criteria for what makes something equal. And just saying that everything should be equal is not really going to cut it. Now that's an objection to this view in general, but a second objection is interesting because it comes specifically from the pandemic. It seems like we have two objectives. One is to make everybody safe, and another is to make everybody equal, assuming this philosophy. But remember, having some people in the water would make things safer than having no people in the water. Now, exactly how safer, I can't really say. But I will say this, now that I can't take my boys surfing anymore, I've had to take them jogging around here, which sucks. And I have definitely come way closer to joggers than I have to people when I was surfing. The reason being that not only are all the joggers out, but also the people who would be surfing are out. Now, the point of closing these beaches in the first place was safety, whereas limited use of the beach would actually make things even safer. This means that this philosophy recommends something that is less safe just so we can have equality for the sake of equality. Here's a third and final objection. People right now are surfing all over the world. Every time I go on my Instagram, I see people out there because their beaches aren't closed, whereas mine is. Now, I start to think, that's not fair, that sucks. And I can even feel pissed because I know that friends of mine are out there, and to my shame, I've had the thought that I hope their beach closes too. But then think about it. Their surfing doesn't change anything for me. Can I really hope that nobody gets to surf just because I don't get to surf? In other words, maybe I shouldn't trust that initial reaction that I have when I find out that somebody else is going to get to surf and I don't. Maybe instead, I should just be happy with what I have and be happy for them that they get to do it. Now, a possible response you could have is that's exactly what a powerful person would say to you who's taking away your stuff. Just be happy with what you've got, right? That's how you would get exploited. Now, possibly you could respond to that so long as we have some other fair way of figuring out who gets to go, the rest of us should be happy that they got to go. In any case, that's only one form of egalitarianism. All the rest of them are going to be a little bit more specific about exactly what should be equal. For example, one form says that the thing that should be equal is income and wealth. In other words, that everybody should have equal purchase power. How would this affect our question? Well, in happier times before the pandemic, somebody who holds this view could say that it shouldn't be the case that just because you're rich, you get to live by the beach. And in fact, where we live, there's a row of houses that are multi-million dollar and that are right on the beach. And basically they have the beach for their yard. And that might cause a ruckus except for the fact that the surf there sucks. But imagine it were great surf though. And imagine that all these rich people just moved in and bought that beachfront property, and now all of a sudden nobody could get out. Something very similar actually happened in Duck, North Carolina. Look that one up. Anyway, people who have this kind of egalitarianism would say, that's not really fair. Everybody should have an equal purchase power. Nobody should be able to purchase us out of the beach. Now that might seem plausible if we're thinking about people living directly on the beach, but when we apply the same idea to just people who live near the beach, it starts to get a little stickier because there's limited real estate. It would be sort of like nobody would get to live by the beach. In any case, what would this view have to say about our question right now? Who gets to surf during the outbreak? Well, this type of egalitarian would probably say something like, the fact that people are living by the beach is already unfair. It's because there is an unequal distribution of money, and that leads people to have good things where other people can't have those good things. So it's not fair that only those people get to surf during the quarantine. Then who gets to surf? Well, possibly no one. Possibly this kind of egalitarian would say we should shut down the beach. Historically, however, I think probably they would come up with something like the following. Imagine the government comes up with a schedule of who's allowed to use the beach and when. Everybody who wants to surf puts in their name, and then it's determined by a lottery when you're allowed to surf. Enforcement is carried out by local officials who will all run around with little clipboards saying, okay, you're allowed to go, wait, you have to wait till the next hour. Now, obviously, that is a massive project for a very limited situation, but honestly, that's the kind of stuff that an egalitarian like this typically historically has said. It's not quite communism, but it's along the same lines. And it's definitely the case that communists don't mind massive government involvement for redistribution of wealth. Another kind of egalitarianism would say that what's really important that's equal is equal human flourishing. A third type of egalitarianism would say that what's important that is equal is that we all have equal human flourishing. Now, exactly what human flourishing means is a little fuzzy, but you can sort of imagine an oak tree that has been gnarled and crumpled over, and the roots aren't going all the way deep. You see that one, and you look and you see another oak tree that's standing firmly and proudly up with roots so deep and very lush green leaves, and you say, this oak tree has flourished. Well, this idea would be that for humans, things are going to be a little bit different because it's not just going to be about physical healthiness, but it's also going to be about mental healthiness, maybe intellectual healthiness. But it's definitely the case that physical healthiness is also part of that flourishing. And obviously, exercise is necessary for physical health. Now, that's not to say that surfing specifically is necessary for human flourishing. That's just to say that some kind of exercise is important. So likely that would mean that in this time of pandemic, people who live by the beach get your exercise at the beach. People who live somewhere else get your exercise in those places. Just make sure that you're exercising and healthy. Now, one notorious objection to this view is that we're all going to have different ideas about what exactly human flourishing is. But in this case, most people are going to agree that human flourishing includes physical health. A fourth kind of egalitarianism says that we should have equal resources. This is a view that's considered by philosopher John Rawls in his famous work, A Theory of Justice. Now, this is different from equality of wealth. Remember my example about my children and rewarding one of them who hasn't done as much work. Philosophers that hold this view will object to philosophers that worry about equal wealth because they'll say, look, rewarding people like that, encouraging them not to do as much and just get the same as everybody else is actually going to be much worse for them. That's not the kind of equality that we want. So instead of giving people equal purchase power, what we should do is give them equal resources that allow them to get equal purchase power, but not reward them already for not having done anything. Now, this idea sounds great, but what exactly constitutes an equal resource? Imagine giving two people opportunity to surf at the same time, the same exact amazing wave, one of whom is a very healthy person, one of whom is a quadriplegic. Have you really given them equal resources? How exactly do we measure this stuff out and say, this person has the same amount of resources as this person for the person that he or she is? Well, another philosopher, Ronald Dworkin, came up with a fascinating scenario for determining exactly what the worth of each resource is. Now, unfortunately, I don't have enough time to get into all the details. It's a complicated story. I'm not going to be able to get into everything, so I'm going to give you a very poor overview. But basically, he says that the worth of a resource is what people would be willing to give up for that resource. So imagine that we all start off before we're born in an auction, and we all don't know what kind of people we're going to be. We don't know what kind of capabilities we're going to have, and we look at the different possibilities out there, and we bid on what we want, and we see what other people bid, and we could change our bids, and ultimately, what would satisfy us? What would we look around and say, this is what I would want, if I, knowing that this could be my situation or that could be my situation, this is what I think is good resource. Again, horribly poor job of giving you an overview, but it's something basically like that. So you could think about the free market as sort of giving you a good idea of what the worth of a natural resource is. Now, philosophers that take this view could say something like, the fact that the taxes that you pay and the lifestyle money that you pay to live in a beach town shows that you are willing to give up this much because it was worth that much. But that doesn't mean that people who don't live at the beach got a bum deal. It might be the case that they just weren't willing to give up the same amount to go and live there. That's what they might say. However, the whole idea here is to give everybody equal resources to start off with, and we can't really do that in the middle of this pandemic. So I'm not really sure we can use that criterion to evaluate who should and shouldn't surf during this time. I don't know, maybe you could, but I just can't think of how. Here's a fifth possible view, and I'm not going to call this an egalitarianism, although there is an important idea of equality here. But maybe it's the case that equality in distribution isn't the most important thing. So consider John Locke's view. John Locke would say that we all have equal rights insofar as we are all equally human. And one of those rights is that we all equally should own ourselves. But if you think about it, part of who we are is the land where we live. And this isn't exactly Locke, but just sort of follow me here. Imagine we all show up to a new place, a new land that no one's ever lived in. Now, I plant some stuff, I build a house, I work the land. You cruise in, and you set up shop inside of my house and you start eating some of the plants that I own. And I say, whoa, you're not allowed to do that. That's wrong. This is my stuff. And you say to me, no, you own yourself, but you don't own the land, right? You don't own the plants. But part of you wants to say, yeah, I kind of do, right? I mean, I put a lot of myself into this work. So John Locke had a very strong view of personal property. He thought that we all had a right to own property. In fact, Thomas Jefferson was sort of inspired or maybe ripped off John Locke, that in the Constitution of the United States, it says all people have an equal right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Locke actually wrote, we all have a right to life, liberty, and property. So we might think that Locke would say, for sure, if you live by the beach, hey, that's your property. You get to use that beach. That's your break, you surf it. However, he also says that right of appropriating land, that's totally your right, so long as taking it away from the public doesn't actually harm other people. But obviously, taking the beach for locals only would harm other people. They couldn't use that beach. So although John Locke has a very strong view of private property, he believes that you have a right to the place where you live. So if you live at the beach, you have a right to that land. He also believes that you don't have a right to public property. You don't have a right to the ocean. So what would Locke's solution be during this pandemic? To be honest, I'm not really sure. He might say shut it down because it can't be, kept public for everybody else. But then again, that does harm everybody, not just some people. So he might go with one of the other possibilities. Let's look at one last philosophy, but before we do, think about the idea of inheritance. That's one idea that egalitarians just disdain. They don't like the idea that dumb luck would dictate who could be born a millionaire and who could be born totally destitute. It doesn't seem fair. You haven't done anything for those things. And likely, the same idea would go for somebody who was born living at the beach. And again, I'm not taking a stand on this, all right? I'm just expressing their view. But if you were born living in a beach house, lucky you. But think about all the other people who weren't. I mean, it's not like they didn't do something right. It was just that they happened not to be lucky enough to be born there. So egalitarians often think, that's not fair. Why should you get priority at the beach just because you had the dumb luck of being born there? But there are other aspects of inheritance that it seems like we can't get mad about. So for example, consider Steph Curry. Right? One thing he inherited is DNA. He inherited his genes from his dad, former NBA basketball player. Steph Curry was born a basketball player. I personally was not born a basketball player. I loved basketball, but I was very non-graceful. But that's okay, right? That's part of who he is. I can't really get mad at him for it. Another thing that he inherited was the environment, right? He grew up in an NBA household. I grew up in a Marine household. Very different. But again, we can't really begrudge him of that, right? It's not like you could go tell Dell, hey, don't raise your son to know anything about basketball. It's not fair that other people don't get that, NBA dad. And one final thing that he inherited there is sort of a basketball culture, right? It's not just some job that he punches a clock for and, he just does it and then gets home and that's it. It's a way of life. It's part of who you are. You are a basketball player. So there are some things that we inherit that are part of us and we can't really deny. Now, given that expanded view of what inheritance is, you could argue the following way. Is it unfair and unequal that some people get to live at the beach and others don't? Yes. And yet, if you live in a surf community, if that's part of who you are, if that's your culture, then maybe during this pandemic, you have more of a claim to surf than people who don't live in that. I should make it clear, by the way, in philosophy, this word inheritance has come to mean something very different. It might sound like I'm talking about like a birthright. I was born at the beach, so, by birth, I get to live at the beach. And that's not the idea at all. Instead, the idea is more of like I said, like a cultural inheritance. So for example, when people talk about cultural appropriation, if it's part of your culture, then it's not that you inherited it because, by birthright, that was dumb luck, but it's more because it's part of who you are. It's part of your everyday life. And the same would go for surfing here. It's not that you were born at the beach. And in fact, this idea wouldn't apply just to people who were born at the beach. It would apply to people who have lived there long enough that it becomes part of who you are. In any case, those are 6 different philosophies and what they might say about who should get to surf during the pandemic. Let me know in the comments which one you agree with. Please also don't forget to like and subscribe. Really helps my channel to grow. And that's all I got for today. Adios.